Hey there, you, me, and DC fans, and welcome if you are new. I am your friendly neighborhood stepson of Krypton, coming to you today with a solo video and the first in what is hopefully our information series, where we bring you much shorter content but much more information packed, starting with the characters you're going to be seeing coming up in James Gunn's new DCU. And because we finally got to see Superman, even though it was a teaser trailer, go check our reaction if you have not seen that yet. It's great stuff. But because we got to see Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner in that trailer, and we know that Kyle Chandler and Aaron Pierre have already been cast as Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart in HBO Max's upcoming Lantern series, we thought, what better place to start an information series than about the Green Lantern Corps and its history, because we know the movie did not give a lot of people much information kind of explaining it. It was a little too convoluted for a movie. So we thought we'd break that down for you here, at least give you as much information as we can pack into the, hopefully, which is going to be a much shorter video for you. So I don't want to waste any more time. I'm going to go ahead and get on into this video. Alright guys, so we're going to go ahead and get this started. Let me just get a little information pulled up here, and that should do it. Now, most people, when you say the words Green Lantern, they think back to that god-awful Abomination from 2011 starring Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. But did you know that the Green Lantern's history dates all the way back to July of 1940? Alan Scott was the original Green Lantern, created by Martin Odell and Bill Finger during the golden age of comics. And unlike subsequent Green Lanterns, he did not get his powers from the Guardians of the Universe. They weren't even a thing yet in the comics. Alan Scott was a railroad engineer who would get his power from the Starheart, which was a magical entity that came to Earth and took the form of a lantern. Later, the lantern saves Alan from a train wreck and instructs him to make a ring that's going to harness it or the Starheart's power. Alan Scott was also one of the founding members of the Justice Society of America, and for my Smallville fans, if you remember back to season 9, Clark actually meets Hawkman, goes to the Hall of Justice, and we don't get to see Alan Scott in person, but we do get to see the photos of him, and you do get to see kind of a brief where they do a flashback, kind of black and white shot of him, and we do get to see the lantern and his power ring. And then obviously he's up on part of the mural that's over, the mantle there we get to see in the Hall of Justice. And Alan Scott also fought all sorts of enemies, some of which might sound familiar to you, including, but not limited to, Solomon Grundy, Vandal Savage, and even Harley Quinn, aka Molly Mayne, who would later become Scott's wife. Now, that's not to be confused with her name is actually Harley Quinn, not Harley Quinn of the Joker. Just happens to sound similar. However, after only 38 short issues in 1949, the comic was canceled when All American Comics dropped superheroes for westerns. His final appearance in the comics would be in All-Star Comics number 57 in 1951. Alan Scott himself would not get another solo series until 2023. As for the character Green Lantern themselves, they would not see a revival in the comics until 1959, when writer John Broome brought him back with the help of artist Gil Kane. Hal Jordan was introduced as the new Green Lantern, as well as the Guardians of the Universe were finally introduced. The Guardians of the Universe are some of the oldest beings in the known DC universe. Originally from the planet Maltus, they are a race of immortal, genius-level beings who created all sorts of technology, including the central battery, which would later power the Green Lantern Corps' rings and mini-lanterns. However, there was one scientist who believed in doing some off-book experiments, one of which was to go back to see the birth of the universe. This scientist's name was Krona, and in doing so, he went back to see how the universe was created. He actually created the Anti-Monitor and, of course, the Antimatter universe to go along with that. Now, for my Arrowverse fans out there, this story might sound kind of familiar, and you would be right. If you remember in the Crisis on Infinite Earths 5-part crossover, they do a very similar storyline. They take some liberties with it. Like, if you remember, it is still on the planet Maltus. However, it was 10,000 years ago, not billions of years ago. And it's Mar Novu who is actually the Monitor and would become the Monitor. And he does in the series, but he is the scientist, not Krona, that is trying to go back to see the birth of the universe and creates the Anti-Monitor and the antimatter universe, whereas Krona is the one that creates all of them in the comics, or at least in the original comics. So it was after this one too many of Krona's universe jeopardizing experiments that a small faction of the Maltesians left the planet Maltus to settle on the planet Oa, which would become the unofficial center of the universe. And this small faction would later become known as the Guardians of the Universe. It was here that they placed the central battery that they had created. This battery was believed to harness the greatest power in the universe, and that is the power of will, represented by the green color of the visual spectrum. It draws power from every sentient being in the known universe. So when the universe began, there were 7 entities. Each represented a different emotion, and each of those emotions was linked to a different color of the visual spectrum. You have red for rage, you have orange for greed, yellow for fear, green, obviously, for will, blue for hope, indigo for compassion, and violet for love. Now, in the movie, it shows the central battery on Oa harnesses the power of will from all sentient beings in the known universe, and that in turn acts as a conduit to the Green Lantern's smaller lantern that ends up charging their rings. However, in the comics as well, you will see multiple times throughout that one or sometimes multiple of these 7 entities at the beginning of time are actually housed within the central battery, one of those which is Ion, who is the entity of will. However, long before the Green Lantern Corps was guarding the universe, the Guardians' first attempt at a universal peacekeeping force was a highly advanced army of robots known as the Manhunters. However, due to a corruption in their programming, who some still blame Krona for, they turned against the Guardians, and they ended up laying waste to an entire sector, Sector 666. They wiped out all living beings within this sector. Once they were gotten back under control, the Guardians relegated them to their own desolate planet in the Lost Sector, where they could do no harm to anybody, and that's where they're just going to live out the remainder of their days. They're not really living, they're robots, but you know what I mean. So it's after this failure of the Manhunters, whose effects would even reach the Martians of the planet Mars, the Guardians created the Green Lantern Corps, and they divided the universe into 3,600 sectors. And a power ring was sent to each of these sectors to select an individual that would become a member of the Green Lantern Corps. And it was said that the rings would look for an individual without fear. Hal Jordan is the first human to ever be selected to be a Lantern, and he would prove to be the Corps' greatest and most dangerous Lantern, eventually even being discharged from the Corps. Hal Jordan proved to the Guardians that it wasn't about not feeling fear, but the ability to overcome that fear and still do what is right is what made a Lantern strong. Eventually, throughout the entire run of Green Lantern in the comics, there would be a total of 12 Lantern Corps to be created. Red, orange, Sinestro, or the yellow Lantern Corps, green, blue, indigo, the Star Sapphire, you have black, white, ultraviolet, gray, and phantom, and there ended up being a 13th Lantern Corps, which acted more as an internal affairs division within the Green Lantern Corps, called the Alpha Lanterns. And in a brief time in the comics, there was even a 14th that was the Gold Lantern Corps. However, much changed with the Green Lantern Corps after the Crisis on Infinite Earth. Both the Corps and the Guardians suffered heavy casualties during the crisis, and it was because of the Guardians' failure to take action that they decided to leave Oa, leaving the Lanterns left to make decisions for themselves and reorganize the Corps. At this time, they stationed an entire team of Lanterns on Earth, led by good old Hal Jordan. So it was at this time that they decided to abandon the one lantern per sector, in part due to their depleted manpower. And they also made the decision to execute Sinestro, which actually activated a failsafe in their lantern rings, which depowered almost all of them with the exception of Hal Jordan and Guy Gardner and a handful of others. This was because they would learn later that it violated the first law in the Book of Oa. Eventually, the Guardians returned to Oa, they reconstructed the Corps, and good old Hal Jordan was selected to go out and find new members for the Corps. Now, during the over 3 billion year run of the Green Lantern Corps, the Corps would see two of its most dangerous foes actually come from within the Corps itself, one of which would bring an end to the entire Green Lantern Corps. The first was Sinestro, who went on to later, with the help of the Anti-Monitor, form the Sinestro Corps, harnessing the yellow power of fear from the entity Parallax. And the second would be Hal Jordan himself. Hal Jordan is eventually driven mad by the destruction of his home on Earth, Coast City, at the hands of Mongol, who most of you might remember Superman, Mongol, Warworld. And Hal Jordan actually becomes possessed by the entity Parallax, who is the actual entity of fear itself, and he just lays waste to the Green Lantern Corps. It's during this fall that most of the lanterns were decimated by Hal Jordan. The main battery was extinguished, and Oa itself was destroyed. And it's during this power vacuum left by the Guardians of the Universe, who were destroyed, that we saw organizations try to rise up to take the place of the Green Lantern Corps, such as the Dark Stars and the Legion. However, none of them could ever achieve the universal reach and expanse that the Green Lantern Corps did. So, with the central battery extinguished, the only Green Lantern to retain his Green Lantern powers was Kyle Rayner, having merged with the entity Ion, the entity of will. It was him and a new Guardian, Thomas Kalmaku. Don't quote me on the exact saying of the last name. You know how we are about pronunciation of names on this channel. They actually rebuilt the Green Lantern Corps using the powers that Parallax stole and the power from Ion themselves. And they were actually able to not only reconstruct Oa, but also bring back the Guardians of the Universe, but as children. So it's at this time, during the reconstruction of the Corps and the amount of universal level threats that had been popping up, they made a choice to have 2 lanterns per sector, bringing the total up to 7,200 members. Parallax was once again imprisoned within the central battery on Oa. And if you remember when I said before, he's not the first entity to ever actually be stored within the central battery, and it wasn't the first time either. So the next big problem, though, however, the Corps faced was they didn't have very many seasoned members. Most were trainees at this time. Now, just when all seemed to be going well for the rebuilding of the Corps, Sinestro pops back up. As I said before, with the help of the Anti-Monitor, he creates the Yellow Lantern Corps, the Sinestro Corps, utilizing the yellow power of fear with the good old help of Parallax as well. It was at this time, after the Sinestro Corps War, that the Guardians rewrote the first law in the Book of Oa, which allows lethal force to be used. Now, if you remember, that's what initially depowered the Green Lantern's rings when they tried to execute him before. So now with the law rewritten, they didn't have that problem. Now, following the Sinestro Corps War, and after what had happened with Hal Jordan being possessed by Parallax as well, it's this time the Guardians established the Alpha Lanterns as that internal affairs division of the Green Lanterns. And their primary goal was to help prevent Blackest Night from occurring, which is a prophecy from a forbidden chapter in the Book of Oa. The Blackest Night prophecy says that the Lantern Corps, all 7 of the original Corps, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and sapphire Corps, would eventually go to war, leading to not only the destruction of the Corps themselves, but the entire universe. And it's at this time that a small faction of the Guardians that had broke away from the other Guardians of the Universe, they create the Black Lantern Corps, comprised of deceased lanterns, to fight the Green Lanterns. And it's later revealed that Necron, who is the physical manifestation of death, He is revealed to be the leader of the Black Lanterns, whose sole mission is to find the white entity, which is basically the embodiment of all life, and destroy it. And this obviously would bring an end to all life in the universe. However, good old Hal Jordan coming back to save the day, he actually merges with the white entity, and with the help of the White Lanterns, they defeat Necron and they banish him from the realm of the living. So it's after Blackest Night that good old Krona, that Maltesian from billions of years ago, looked to imprison the seven entities within the Guardians of the Universe in an effort to control them. And it's good old Guy Gardner, Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner, and John Stewart who recover their Green Lantern rings, join the fight against Krona. Hal Jordan ends up defeating Krona and freeing the Guardians. But at this point in time, the Guardians decide that Hal is a little too dangerous to be a member of the Green Lantern Corps, and they discharge him from the Corps. Alright guys, so that kind of gives a brief history of the Green Lantern Corps and our good old buddy Hal Jordan, Guy Gardner, and John Stewart. There is a lot more information with the history of the Corps, and there's been a lot that's been retconned over the course of the years in the comics themselves, so I wasn't able to cover everything. If there is something you would like me to specifically address in another video, please let me know down below, or if there was something maybe I just completely altogether skipped over that you would like to mention in the comments. Let us know down below. We're trying to bring out as much of the information as possible, but you know, when you're dealing with a course of 60 plus years in the comics and things getting retconned so much, sometimes it can be hard to get all of the information in there without having a 3-hour Green Lantern video. And with that in mind, and to keep this video as short as is humanly possible, that is going to wrap it for us on this first informational series of You, Me, and DC. Until next time, guys, I will see you then.